And ladies and gentlemen, we have another guest who's now joining us, Pramit Pal Chaudhary. He's the head of South Asia practice at Eurasia Group. Thank you very much, Mr. Chaudhary, for joining us. Your first reactions on this deal. This has been in the works for quite some time now. What does it really bring to India in the near term, in the long term? If you could talk to us about those aspects.
So in the near term, it accomplishes our most ambitious FTA with a European country. Keep in mind, we've already signed one with the European Free Trade Agreement Association, which is largely Switzerland and Norway and a few other smaller economies. With the UK one, we are now in many ways ready, if you wish, to tackle the most difficult FTA, which is the one with the European Union, which has been negotiations have been going on and off for 16 years. So this gives us a template. Second, I think what it does accomplish is gives us a streamlined FTA, if you wish, because while we have made there are major concessions on both sides on industrial goods and products and consumer products, which the previous speaker, there isn't that much on the service side yet. We're seeing a bit of market access for many areas. But what seems to have happened, and we have to get the full FTA text, is that a lot of the add-ons, things like carbon taxes, labor mobility, and so on, have been to a large extent being reduced or going to be negotiated or worked out later in separate agreements, which is perfect in many ways because that's what we need now. We need rapid-fire FTAs as the WTO system, which has driven the international trading system, is starting to fall apart. The actual amount of trade involved, I mean, we're looking at some of the preliminary modeling that's coming out. India will see our exports to the Britain rise by about 25% over the next several years. That's about 10 billion pounds. Our imports from Britain will rise about 15 billion pounds. Over roughly the same period. We're not clear yet about service figures yet. That partly depends on a number of other issues. But there'll also be things like trade facilitation and so on, which will improve or speed up and reduce the costs of trading and investing with each other. Keep in mind one of the peculiarities of Britain compared to almost any other major developed economy, is that it is the single largest recipient of Indian investment in Europe. In fact, Indian companies invest more in Britain than they do in the rest of Europe put together. We are, on a good year, the second largest source of FDI for Britain, almost always the third largest. So when we import a car, from Britain, we are often importing an Indian car, an Indian-owned one, Jaguar Land Rover being a perfect example. So it's a very unusual relationship in which our goods that we import from Britain are effectively Indian-owned.
Right. And Mr. Pal, autos and, of course, whiskey and mobility, these were the key sticking points in negotiations so far as this FTA is concerned. But given that India is now looking at forging one-on-one deals, which has actually been fast-tracked for the world as well post-Donald Trump's tariff policies, how could this really impact global trade blocs like RCEP or WTO's role?
So, as you said, now increasingly bilateral trade agreements, and the one with the United States being the most striking example, are being done in effect without following the WTO rules. So, for example, if we make major tariff concessions to America, which it seems to be in the cards, they will no longer be applied to other countries, other WTO members automatically under the most favored nation status clause, which has been a tradition in the past. This is a violation of the WTO. But on the other hand, reciprocal tariffs, as imposed by the United States, are also violations of the WTO. So the WTO is falling apart. And if it is doing so, it is absolutely imperative for any major economy to have FTAs as your plan B. Otherwise, if you all start to break the WTO, what exactly is your trade relationship with your major trading partners? Those include the Persian Gulf, in our case, ASEAN, China, Britain, Europe, and the United States. We need to have FTAs ready. So that's why as the WTO slowly falls apart,
Right.
having FTAs with countries like the UK, with the US, with the
Right.
EU, and new ones with ASEAN, for example, and the Gulf Cooperation Council are absolutely essential for
Right.
our backup. And what, as I said, we're now seeing as countries in a need to do this in a
Central,
hurry.
and they do really insulate our trade and our trade partnerships as well in light of global disruptions, Mr. Chaudhary. But as the immediate next steps, what do you anticipate from a manufacturing and services side?
So for us, I mean, well, for Britain, the game will now be to actually implement a lot of this. In other words, trade facilitation agreements, work out some of the. We have a separate bilateral investment negotiation that needs to be completed because that, in many ways, brings in the FDI flows that we need to complement the trade. Um, and eventually a better set of technology understandings between the two sides, which again would complement these FTAs. So we need to work on a lot of that, and then of course to move on to the EU. That's the big one. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU commissioner, had come to India and said she wanted an FTA by the end of the year. And the British one will now give us a template to go to the European Union and say, look, this is an outline. Let's use this as the basis for our negotiations.
Right, Mr. Chaudhary, but speaking of the EU FTA and of course the US and India FTA, what are the challenges that you foresee? Because the EU FTA has also been going on for a very, very long time. While this does give a template, but there are several challenges that remain. Similarly, with the US FTA as well, there are concerns around agriculture, for example, market access. That remains a challenge. What do you make of those?
So agriculture will probably be our biggest sticking point with the United States. And I think grain, sugar, dairy will be the areas we will see India, from what the reports are indicating, India has offered quotas into or a certain degree of market access into India up to a certain limit, but they want to maintain high tariff positions. But in return, we are prepared to consider things like concessions on cranberries and blueberries and apples and so on, which are already import in very large numbers. That we'll have to see how that plays out. The other area, I actually don't think tariffs on goods will be a problem, on industrial goods. India is actually competitive against America in most of them already, in pharmaceuticals, jewelry, auto components, electronics. In fact, our biggest electronic export to the United States is iPhones, an American product. The other area will be the digital technology area, data localization, cross-border data, and so on. We are already very closely aligned with the United States on most of those digital standards, but there are some tweaks that we have done to support Indian companies or discriminate in favor of Indian companies. And those would have to be conceded for the most part. But in return, we are probably going to get major concessions or major offers from America on supply chain integration and semiconductors, advanced materials, drones, and so on. And so I think the trade-off there is well worth it. So the EU is a slightly different story. We don't have a strategic relationship with the EU. And the EU has, 25 members that have to come on board on different areas. And they're not as big a technology partner as the US is. On the other hand, they're not overly concerned about agriculture because they also are very protectionist about agriculture. So it's a slightly different set of negotiations. For the EU, the real issue has been the non-trade issues that they keep on raising: labor, environment, gender, and so on and so forth, and carbon tax, which is a big issue with the EU. And those are going to be why the EU will be a bit more difficult than it is, because these are areas India really doesn't feel should be part of an FTA.
Right. Right. Mr. Chaudhary, one final question before we wrap up this discussion. The big message, would you agree that India is sending out is the fact that it wants to do away with protectionism, it wants to foster more competition here so that consumers can benefit. So do you see that, change in India's stance when it comes to doing away with protectionism?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the core, because the MFN clause no longer applies, in other words, what we concede to one country does not automatically apply to others. It means the one country that we are not competitive in most all manufactured goods which is China. We don't have to concede that space to China anymore. So in other words, we give a zero tariff, let's say, to America in electronics. That does not mean we have to give that zero tariff to China, because otherwise we'd be flooded with Chinese goods. But minus China, ironically, what we're finding is that we're actually quite competitive. We can compete against the American auto industry. We can compete against American pharmaceuticals, and so on. In that case, we are therefore, once you make that acceptance of the WTO not necessarily being the driving force behind our trade policy, then you can cease to be as protectionist as we are. And including in manufactured goods. Services, of course, we've always been very competitive, but now we are prepared to make space in the industrial side, and this changes the entire nature of our trade policy.
Absolutely. Mr. Pal, thank you very much for joining us here on ET Now and sharing your thoughts on what this does, not only what it means for industry right here in India, for India-UK relations, but how this presents a basic structure for other FTAs to be done as well, given the fact that this is the first FTA that's been done by India, even as the world is reeling under the pressure of Donald Trump's tariff policies. Thank you very much once again for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to this other story that we are tracking here on India Tonight. Well, the NSE reported its fourth quarter earnings earlier today. The company reported 2,650 crores profit in the fourth quarter, which is 7% higher than what NSE reported in the same quarter last year. Meanwhile, revenue from operations fell 18% to 3,771 crores, and that on account of lower volumes in cash markets and derivatives segment. And with that, it's time for us to wrap this edition of India Tonight. Hope you liked watching it as much as we did putting it together for you. From me and the entire team, goodbye and thank you very much for watching.